Hey everyone, Dr. Lee Bryce here with your week 4 video. Now, today we're going to be talking about specific institutions, the education system, and the criminal system. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. But I just wanted to remind you that this is actually going to be your last video for the semester. Remember, I sent out an email to everyone yesterday about the fact that this summer session 2 is a little bit shorter than summer session 1 by almost a week. And it just started to feel very overwhelming, like there was too many assignments. So I would rather get rid of week 5 smaller assignments so that everyone has opportunity to submit their final paper on time and really finish the semester strong. So I'm not going to take those points out of your end of semester grade. Instead, I'm going to do an average of your scores for discussion boards 1 through 4 and your weekly reading notes 1 through 4. And then those averages will be the score you get for discussion board 5 and weekly reading notes 5, respectively. You also should have this in writing because, like I said, I emailed everyone about it. But should you have any questions, feel free to email me, or you can also schedule a Zoom one-on-one meeting with me if you have any follow-up questions. All right, so that's sort of housekeeping and announcements, important things like that. We'll go ahead and jump in. I framed this lecture thinking about the criminal justice system and what makes good policy. Because remember, as we think about social problems and how we socially construct social problems as a society, oftentimes there's a policy component. And so we learn that through the textbook. And so typically when I give this lecture in a face-to-face class in real time, I do a brainstorming exercise before going into the 2 different lectures. So I'll do a variation of that for this online class. And then obviously you won't have questions. And then I'll do the exit pass and reminders. Okay. So when we think about the criminal justice system in terms of being a social institution and thinking about some of the social problems that exist within our society because of the criminal system, we have to ask ourselves what makes good criminal justice policy. And you can see that there are scare quotes around the word good because I'm suggesting that this word is arbitrary, right? Because the way that we socially construct quote unquote good and bad policy, it varies over time in different parts of the country. Perhaps your political beliefs and your upbringing and your worldview all influence how you understand what you believe to be good or bad criminal justice policy. In recent years, we've seen an evolution of sort of how we understand good and bad criminal justice policy based off of some high profile social movements, right? And so if you think about entities like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, that's a really successful social movement in more recent years in the United States that's really pushed for changes specifically to criminal justice related policy. We can also think about who should be making decisions regarding criminal justice policy. And again, this can also change over time. Should it be people who are at the highest level? Should it be judges and lawyers? Or should people, everyday members of society like you and me, should we have more of a say in what kind of policies are passed and what type of laws we have in our society? Is policy socially constructed? So usually I ask this question early on in the semester before students have read about how it is. So of course you all would know the answer to that is yes. And then again, like I said, we have different backgrounds. So that's important for thinking about social constructs specific to the criminal justice system. And it means that, if we were doing this lecture in real time, face to face, that might lead to questions about, different terminology and things like that. We all come to this space with different worldviews and different backgrounds, and our understanding of the criminal system varies based off of those experiences that we have. Okay, So now I'm going to backpedal for a minute. I'm going to talk about education. So I've mentioned before that I wrote my dissertation on Title IX policy, which is a policy meant to protect against gender discrimination in public schools. So that's K through 12 schools as well as colleges and universities. Now, my research focuses on higher education, and of course, that's more relevant to you all since you're college students, but certainly we can think about how Title IX policy impacts or has the potential to impact people who are affiliated with K through 12 schools. And notice I said people affiliated because while the focus of Title IX policy is about protecting students, Title IX is also used to protect employees who work for schools. Okay, so why is Title IX important to our conversation around social problems and policy and things like that? Well, I think it's an important one to explore more thoroughly in the college setting because it has the potential to impact all of us. Everyone here is somehow affiliated with the university, whether you're a student or an employee, or perhaps you're both if you work for the university. This is a good example of a policy that's evolved over time. So while the language and the letter of the law has not changed in and of itself, the way that people have interpreted and implemented and utilized Title IX policy has evolved over time. So it's a really good demonstration of this idea that policy is socially constructed and our understanding of a specific policy can change over time. Because it continues to change based off of the experiences of students and employees. And, if we need to utilize Title IX in a particular way, then the powers that be, politicians and lawyers and people like that have deemed Title IX sort of this roadmap for addressing issues related to gender-based violence and gender issues very broadly. And then, of course, I'm an expert on it. I wrote my dissertation on Title IX, so that's one of the other reasons why we're examining this policy more closely. I will say that we do talk about gender-based violence when we talk about Title IX these days. So if things like sexual assault or stalking, intimate partner violence, things like that, if that's triggering for you, just be aware that those topics will likely come up as I give examples and things like that. So if you need to turn the recording off at any time, that's fine. And if you have any follow-up with me because you did not listen to the full lecture this week because of trigger, just email me, let me know, and that's totally fine. Okay. All right. So what is Title IX? It is a policy that was implemented in 1972 by this politician, Patsy Mink, and the meat and potatoes of the policy states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefit of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, the reason why Patsy Mink was so passionate about creating this policy and passing it is because she wanted to go to medical school when she graduated with her bachelor degree. And so she applied to medical schools, but she got denied. And when she followed up and asked why did she get denied, they told her it was because they only had a certain number of spots available for the incoming class, and they prioritized men because men have families to support. And so literally the only reason she didn't get into medical school was because she was a woman. She ended up going with Plan B, which was law school, and she got in. That led to her trajectory into becoming an elected official in Hawaii. And so she wanted to ensure that future girls and women would not have that same experience as her, that they would not be prevented from getting into a educational program based solely on their gender. And so she worked to pass this policy, and she was successful. So in the beginning, when Title IX was first conceived and implemented, it was not about gender-based violence. It was about enrollment into a specific program and not discriminating based off of gender. So it's evolved a couple of times over the years since the early 1970s. You can see by this picture, it probably has something to do with sports, right? And in fact, when people hear the term Title IX, oftentimes sports still comes to mind. The reason being is Title IX quickly became a way to ensure that girls and women's sports had equal funding. So it used to be before Title IX, if there was a girls' team and they wanted to have money for their jerseys or to travel to play other teams, they would have to do fundraisers. They'd have to have bake sales and things like that because all of the money that schools had for sports went to men's sports and boys' sports. And so with the Title IX policy in place, all of a sudden, there had to be equal money spent for girls and boys sports and men and women's sports. And so that's why you see an equal number of sports scholarships at the collegiate level. It's why you'll see an equal number of sports teams for both men and women and things like that. And so that means Title IX really started out as a civil rights policy, protecting the civil rights of girls and women, whether we're talking about entry into a specific program, educational program, or sports, it was about civil rights and equitable access. So how did it evolve into this thing that has to do with the criminal justice system and criminalizing people? Well, under Obama's administration, so, circa 2008, 2010, that era, there were women across the country who were frustrated that they were hearing all these stories where they or their friends were reporting situations of gender-based violence. So rape, attempted rape, stalking, things like that. And their administration was not doing anything about it. Even when these women had proof, the administration was really sweeping these issues under the rug and they were underreporting and things like that. Despite the fact that we've known since the 80s that approximately 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 women will experience rape or attempted rape during their time as a college student. We know this is an issue we've known for a long time, and yet administration at schools across the country they really weren't working to address this. And so these women led a social movement, a grassroots movement on college campuses across the United States to hold their campus administration accountable for these really serious things that were happening on campus. They wrote to the federal government, the Secretary of Education, and they said, we want some sort of policy or law we can use to hold our administrators accountable. And eventually, under Barack Obama's administration, they said you can use Title IX. And so young women across the country started filing Title IX complaints to address specific issues of gender-based violence that they were experiencing. And it has since become best practice for colleges to do that. And in fact, they will be in jeopardy of losing federal funding if they do not implement Title IX policy in that way. And so, for example, schools have to do a campus climate survey every other year to look to see what is happening on their campus. What are the rates of gender-based violence? What are the rates of stalking and sexual assault and sexual harassment and things like that? And so that's where it becomes this more criminal justice specific policy, because now we're talking about holding perpetrators of crime accountable. People who perpetrate gender-based violence, though they're perpetrators of crime. So it's no longer about the civil liberties, the civil rights of girls and women, although certainly it does address that as well, but it's about holding perpetrators of gender-based violence accountable in a criminalized way. Now, of course, a Title IX complaint is outside of the jurisdiction of the criminal system, but oftentimes when someone pursues a Title IX complaint through the university, they're strongly encouraged and end up also filing a police report so that the incident will also hit the criminal system. And so those two processes are pretty intimately connected, and especially at universities like CCU, where there's a campus police force, that also because of that connection, women are more likely to come forward to police because there are police readily available to report to on campus. And if you'd like to learn more about gender-based violence on college campuses and the grassroots social movement that led to Title IX being a thing about gender-based violence, I encourage you to watch this documentary called The Hunting Ground. This link will take you to the trailer for the documentary, and it's available. Last time I checked, it was streaming for free on Netflix, but it's available. It's usually available on some streaming site. Okay, so we can start to see how education, there are social problems that exist within education as a social institution, and there are policies in place meant to address those social problems. So, gender based violence and it being so prevalent on college campuses being the social problem, Title IX being the policy solution. And we can see how there are different social movements involved with getting that policy implemented and holding the powers that be, in this case, school administrators, accountable and perpetrators accountable, right? And so you can start to see in real time how this is an example of sort of all the different things that the textbook covers with regard to social problems. Okay, here you can see what Title IX looks like in how it's sort of framed by the media. So if sort of mainstream society doesn't understand something to be a social problem, then is it a social problem, right? Like that's one of the things the authors of our textbook challenge us to think about. And so you can see here that yes, this is something that mainstream society is more and more aware of, especially because of some of those social movements I mentioned earlier on the last slide. And then that leads to an increase in media coverage of this issue. And you can see that, most of this has to do with equity, whether that's in terms of gender or race or both. Title IX really brings up issues around social problems and equity and things like that. And then, of course, you can think about what does Title IX look like on your campus? Do you know who's in charge of Title IX at CCU? Do you know what resources are available to you and your friends should you need Title IX resources? Do you know the names of people, the offices to go to should you need those resources? I would argue that a lot of students actually don't know the answers to those questions, and that means that this is a continued social problem. I mean, that the lack of information around Title IX in and of itself is part of the problem, I think. Anyway, okay. I'm actually not going to go into my dissertation themes. I'm going to transition into thinking about the criminal system as a social institution that leads to a lot of social problems within our society. So specifically, I'm going to talk about bail reform. One of the things that I think has become common knowledge because of social movements, contemporary social movements in the United States, is that pretty much most people living in the United States now have a basic understanding of the fact that we over-incarcerate folks in the US more than any other country. So if you compare our rates of incarceration to other countries, even countries like Russia or China, we actually have much higher rates of incarceration compared to our overall population than any other country. And so this is often referred to as the prison industrial complex. You've probably heard that in some of your other classes here at CCU, especially if you're taking sociology and criminal justice classes. And so students will learn about this, whether that's, because of social media stuff on their own time or because of classes they've taken in our department, and they get frustrated and they say, well, what can we do to lower rates of incarceration? What can we do to address this social problem? What kind of policies can we implement? We have these social movements that are leading to awareness, but what can we do to change things? And so it can be hard to think about concrete policy and concrete things that can be implemented to address this social problem of over-incarceration. And so I look to bail reform as a really good example of something tangible that is being done in states across the United States. And so I'm going to talk about Illinois, and you'll see why I have a connection to what's happening in Illinois. But you'll start to see how it can reduce the number of people who are in jail, especially folks who are in jail awaiting trial, and they're in jail because they can't pay their bail. So, mass incarceration has gained public attention, creating pressure to decrease the number of inmates incarcerated in the United States. Mass incarceration is the idea that the United States criminalizes and incarcerates more people than any other country, leading to harm, especially for the most vulnerable folks within our society. So this is sort of how mass incarceration has been framed as a social problem, especially by those social movements that are sort of leading the cause to address this issue and to spread awareness on it. Like I said, students want to know, how do we make the current system better? And so I have real world experience trying to implement bail reform policy in Hawaii when I was working on my PhD. And Illinois is an interesting case study because it's the first state to completely abolish the cash bail system. And I also have a colleague and a close friend who works in Cook County Jail in that system. So that's sort of my personal connection to it. What is bail reform? Well, first let's backpedal and say, what is bail? Bail is the temporary release of someone accused of a crime while they're awaiting trial. So they have not been convicted of the crime they are accused of. Typically in the United States, folks pay money or they go to a bail bondsman and put down collateral to get out of jail while they await trial. So you can see, if we think about privilege and intersectionality, who is more likely to get out of jail while they're awaiting trial? Folks who are wealthier, right? Because they have the money and the collateral to put down to get out of jail. So we start to think about, who does this benefit and who does this not benefit, especially thinking about some of those structural issues within social institutions. Certainly, the criminal system as a social institution has very structural issues related to socioeconomic status, right? Class issues. So Illinois very recently passed the Safety Act, which eliminates cash bail for the entire state. And in fact, it went into practice at the beginning of 2024, January 2024. So in a lot of ways, we're still learning what the impact of this policy is going to be because it's very new. We don't necessarily know what the results will be and how it will get implemented by judges and by lawyers. And so it'll sort of be interesting to see how that plays out, because we have policy, but then the way it's interpreted and implemented can vary, and it can evolve over time, right? How Title IX and the way that's implemented has evolved over time, over decades, right? We can see how that will likely be true of bail reform policy. So this just sort of shows you the social construction of bail reform and the historical context of how that came to be. And so in the 1920s to 1960s was the first generation of bail reform, where social movement folks focused on release on recognizant. So releasing people on bail, but without money, and trying to get rid of bail bondsmen. This resulted in the Federal Bail Act of 1966, which focused on alternatives to money bail system, favoring release on recognizant and a defendant's ties to the community. So it's this idea that if someone can prove that they have strong ties to the community, they're not going to skip town before their trial, they have a family, they have a job, that sort of thing, then we can release them without necessarily making them pay a large sum of money. So before 1970, ensuring court appearance was the only legal reason for limiting defendants' pretrial liberties. So the only way you were allowed to keep someone, or well, in theory, the only way you were supposed to keep someone in jail while they were awaiting trial was if they were a flight risk. Otherwise, it was seen as a limitation of their liberties and their rights as citizens of the United States. But then we see conservative backlash to this stuff happening, this first generation of reform. So the second generation of reform goes from 1960s to 1980s, and folks here are focusing on a defendant's risk to public safety, leading to detention over bail. So it's this idea that we don't necessarily care about the rights of the accused so much anymore. We're focusing on will they potentially do harm to other people if they leave jail while they're awaiting trial? And if judges and lawyers feel that there is a risk of that person doing more harm, committing more crimes, then we're going to keep them in jail. Again, this leads to policy. The Bail Reform Act of 1984. Public safety becomes a valid reason for limiting pretrial liberties for quote unquote high risk defendants. And we can see how structurally this idea of someone being a high risk defendant is very socially constructed, and it has a lot to do with identity. So if someone is poor, if people of color, gender plays a factor in how judges perceive someone to be high risk or not to be high risk while they're awaiting trial. And so here you can see that social movements happen. There'll be a push for more conservative or more liberal policy. We get policy changes. And so you can see how social movements and the social construction of social problems is happening in real time. If we use this example of the criminal system as a social institution, focusing on bail reform specifically. So then we get to contemporary times, modern times. The third generation of reform started in the 1990s, and it is in full swing today, where advocates are asking, who do we release, who do we detain, and how do we do it? So really focusing on statistics and looking at some of these structural inequities that exist within the criminal system. The focus has been to extend other conditions of release for defendants. So if the person is accused of a crime, let's say stalking an ex-partner, or that's a bad example, actually. Well, whatever. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but limiting the contact a accused person might have toward someone that they've committed a crime to or something like that. And then mandatory mental health and drug programming. So if the person committed a crime or is suspected of committing a crime because of addiction or because of mental health issues, then the idea is that if they seek out services to address some of those issues they're experiencing, they will be very significantly less likely to reoffend while they're awaiting their trial. And then finally, eliminating the cash bail system is sort of the end-all be-all goal. If you'd like to learn more about the different steps that Illinois went through as far as the political process of getting the Safety Act, which eliminates cash bail, passed, this is a really great resource. It's a .gov website, and it goes over some of the different meetings and conversations that occurred amongst politicians and community stakeholders to get to a place where they could pass a statewide ban on the cash bail system. Okay. So, oftentimes there's policy, and then that policy gets interpreted in a particular way, and it gets implemented in a particular way based off of that. So just because the people who wrote that policy and passed that policy have a specific vision of what it will look like, it doesn't necessarily mean that's how it'll play out in real time, because things always evolve, right? We saw how Title IX implementation and interpretation has evolved. So I talked to my friend, Carrie Wright, who is a program manager at Cook County Jail, specifically working on gardening programs for folks who are in jail there. And I asked, what do you think about safety? And so essentially, Carrie talks about how it's long overdue, how for, the 15 years he's worked for Cook County Jail, he's seen a lot of inmates in the gardening program who were arrested for nonviolent misdemeanors and petty theft and have stayed incarcerated for months, sometimes years, simply because they couldn't pay bail. They couldn't make bail, and so they're awaiting trial, and they are serving time for a crime they may or may not have committed, but they certainly have not been convicted of. And then he goes on to talk about sort of what this means for the community and for the people who are family members of and love and care for people who are accused of a crime, who are in jail. And now it can really work to heal communities where there are high rates of incarceration, because when family members are able to go home and be members of their family unit while they're awaiting trial, it really can heal and make the community stronger. So you can read that on your own time. If you'd like to learn more about some of the programming that Carrie is doing at Cook County Jail, you can click here to learn about the gardening program. Most recently, Carrie helped to bring in a beekeeping program where inmates learn how to work with bees. And actually, the person they hired to run that program is someone who's formerly incarcerated. And so he knows what it's like to be in jail and prison and that sort of thing. And this is sort of his way of giving back to the community. Now, one of the other reasons why these programmings are so cool, thinking about how I started off the lecture today with students voicing their frustration that they want to do something to lower rates of incarceration in the US, but what can we do? What's tangible? Well, these types of programs in jails and prisons that teach inmates skill sets makes it so that folks are less likely to reoffend once they're released. And so, for example, with the gardening program, they also sell that produce at farmers markets. And so inmates learn all different types of skills, not just gardening. And then Carrie has been able to write reference letters for folks who leave jail, leave Cook County, so that they can get a job where they're making a little bit better money than minimum wage, and then they're less likely to reoffend. And so, for example, a lot of folks will do like landscaping work and that sort of thing because a lot of the skills they learn in the gardening program are transferable. In landscaping, they tend to not be as concerned with folks who have a criminal record. So just a little bit of interesting information. And I'm sure there are similar type programs at jails and prisons in South Carolina and other states, but I just have a personal connection to the Cook County jail stuff. In Illinois, like I said, is an interesting case study for thinking about specific policy that can work to combat this social problem of over-incarceration because they're the first state to pass a bill eliminating the cash bail system. Okay. So I'm going to leave you with this slide of questions. You might see these questions again soon. Perhaps they will be questions you can answer for your fourth discussion post. But be thinking about criminal justice and education and policy and what makes good policy and these connections to social problems and social movements and things like that. Okay. Here's your exit pass link. Here's a video showing more information about Carrie's gardening program. And I actually just realized I left off the reminder slide, but just remember that you have discussion board 4 and weekly reading notes 4 due this week. And then your paper, your final reflection paper is also due. My grades are due on, Monday, August 5th at 5 p.m., so into business day. So you got to get me everything you want graded by Sunday, August 4th at 11:59 p.m. at the very, very latest. But other than that, that's all I got for you. Have a good week, and I hope everyone finishes the semester strong. I will answer any questions you might have on email, or you can also schedule a Zoom meeting with me if you need to. All right, bye, everyone.